I thank the Right Reverend Prelate for arranging this debate and for her excellent introduction and for her reliance on expertise in her introduction, and I hope to reflect that approach also in my speech. We are debating early intervention and looking at the invaluable House of Lords library briefing, as we always have for these debates. It talks about early intervention specifically for children with atypical development. But I want to focus, first of all, on what's typical for children in the UK. If we look at a Children's Society report from August 2019, it showed the level of happiness of our children is the lowest for a decade. 250,000 children said they were unhappy with their lives. A third of 10 to 17-year-olds were fearful about the future. 1 in 8 children was unhappy at school. If we go back to 2016, there was a UNICEF study that placed Britain 13th out of 16 countries for the happiness of our 8-year-olds. We have a problem widely acknowledged with child poverty. There are 10 constituencies in the country where more than 50% of children, whole communities of children, are living in poverty. Overall, around the country, 4.6 million children are living in poverty. Now, if we look at where the support and the services for children, both those who need special interventions and children in general, come from, local council funding has fallen by 17% on local services. That's nearly £300 per person in the past decade. And 57% of the budget for services goes to social care, under huge pressure, of course, for the need for early interventions, among other causes. Now, that's meant the loss of libraries, parks and other services. So I put it to your Lordship's House that we have a real problem in our treatment of all children, and this will actually increase the number of children who will have what will be seen in historical terms as atypical development and who will need intervention. So I turn briefly to some reflections on what that intervention should be like and how it should be funded. And I go to a report from the Sutton Trust, which recommended the government move towards early years teachers all having qualified teacher status, with increases in pay, conditions and status to match. I think we could all agree that there can be no more important job than taking care of our youngest children, and particularly helping those children who need extra support to reach standard landmarks. Now, I will very shortly be joining the National Education Union outside. They're concerned about the funding for post-16 education. We have a problem of how we prioritise education right across the board in our country, I would put to your Lordships. Now, I move to another point brought forward by the Sutton Trust in a report they prepared called Sound Foundations in 2014. And they stressed the importance of prioritising quality of services, particularly for the under-3s. 2 things I want to pick out from that. One is the focus on play-based activities and routines. And the other is the opportunities to move and be physically active. Now, last night I was joining the National Trust downstairs as they were celebrating their 125th anniversary, and they were focusing on the importance of access to nature for all of us. But if we think about children, and particularly children who are struggling, that access to nature, the chance to play, to run around, is absolutely crucial. All of the expert evidence shows that. Yet we know this is being denied to many of our children, and particularly children who may need early intervention. And I'm thinking here of the recent exposure in London of the fact that children living in housing divided between social housing and purchased housing, whereby the children were being excluded from the playgrounds in the social housing. Now, if we're going to create situations where we need intervention, that's the kind of behaviour that's going to do it. So, the point I wish to make, really, to your Lordship's House is there will always be a need for acute interventions for some children whose development is not proceeding as it should be. But we are in a risk now of a situation where the social circumstances, the economic circumstances, are creating more and more children who are in that situation. That is then going to demand more and more resources for more and more stretched services, and we're risking being in a downward spiral. So I would say to your Lordship's House that we need to look, as many of the speeches have already effectively focused on, the detail of the services for early intervention. But we do also need to look at issues of equality, not social mobility for the few, not help for those who are most acutely affected, but a decent life for all of our children.